Welcome to From Rome.Info video. My name is Brother Alexis Bugnolo, and this is the documentary on the renunciation of Pope Benedict, the facts, the laws, and the consequences. In this episode, the third episode, I'm going to discuss what happened on February 11th, 2013, what Pope Benedict actually said. And this topic might seem to be of really no point, and well, I'm going to skip this third episode, but this episode you need to watch because nearly no one knows what actually happened that day in the sense of what Pope Benedict said. Because to know that, you have to be an expert in Latin, since he spoke in Latin. And since all the translations done, except one or two, are falsified, and not just a few points, in dozens of points, what you think he said is what they want you to think, not what he actually said. So first, I could read the text in Latin and then discuss it, but let's first hear what the Pope actually said. So what I did, since I've translated more than 9,000 pages of Latin, is I've translated this document two ways. One, according to which I think what he wanted to say, which is not really a translation, it's my idea of it. And another according to what he actually did say. So let's do what he actually did say, since that's historic. And I've translated it in such a way so that an English speaker with no knowledge of Latin will be able to see, experience, react, know immediately that there's something wrong with this text because it just doesn't make sense. So all the errors in the Latin I have translated as errors in English. It's just kind of a very little translation I've done so that you can understand that there's something really wrong with this document. And so that you can have the same reactions that an expert Latinist would have had on February 11th when he saw that Latin text or heard that Latin text. And considering that none of the Cardinals reacted the way you're going to react in just a moment, I tend to think none of them knew what he said. This is an important historical point. So on February 11th, 2013, the Pope did not call the Cardinals into the Clementine Hall to discuss his renunciation. They had already arranged to meet there for the canonization of several saints. Most importantly are the martyrs of Otranto, which is a small city on the heel of Italy, where in the 16th century the Turks landed and butchered everyone in town. They refused to become Muslims, so they all were decapitated, and their skulls are under the cathedral's high altar. I've been there. It's an amazing town. The entire town went to heaven as martyrs. One of the most blessed towns on the face of the earth. And a very rare occurrence, because usually in such occurrences a few Catholics decide to become Muslims and give up the faith, but there at Otranto, men, women, children, babies, adults, everyone decided they would prefer death than apostatize from the faith. So he was calling together for these three renunciations, and at the end of the ceremony, after the voting was taken by the Cardinals and the Pope approved the canonization of these martyrs and the other saints that were involved that day, he pulled out a paper and he began to read it. And this document is called the Declaratio of February 11th, 2013. So let's, without further ado, I will read the document, and then we'll go back and look at the Latin. Okay. I'm going to read it, though, in my translation so that you, an English speaker, can know exactly what the Pope said and didn't say, and hear all the errors he made. Okay. And this Latin document is normally identified by its first three words, non solum propter. Not solely for the sake of 3 acts of canonization have I convoked you towards this consistory, but also to communicate on behalf of the life of the Church your act of decision-making of great importance. Having scouted out my conscience again and again before God, I have arrived at certain cognition, my strength by my worsening age are no longer apt, to administer the munus patrinum equitably. I am well conscious that this munus, according to his spiritual essence, ought to be pursued not only by doing and speaking, but no less by suffering and praying. Yet, however, in the world of our season, subjected to hasty acts of change, and perturbed by questions of great value on behalf of the life of faith, A certain vigor of body and soul is necessary to steer the bark of St. Peter and the gospel to announce, which strength in me in these furthest months is lessening in such a manner that to well administer the ministry committed to me, I ought to acknowledge my incapacity. On which account, well conscious of the weight of this act, I declare in full liberty that I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, the successor of St. Peter, committed to me through the hands of the Cardinals on the 19th of April 2005, to vacate from the 28th of February at 8 o'clock in the evening, Rome time, the See of St. Peter, and that a conclave to elect a new Supreme Pontiff be convoked by those who are competent. Dearest brothers, from my whole heart, you I thank for all your physical love and the work by which you bore with me the weight of my ministry, and I ask pardon for all my failings. Moreover, now we completely trust the Holy Church of God to the care of the Most High Pastor, our Lord Jesus Christ, and we implore His Holy Mother Mary to assist with her maternal goodness the Cardinal Fathers in electing a new Supreme Pontiff. As far as regards myself, may I also wish to serve with my whole heart in a future by a life dedicated to prayer for Holy Mother Church. Now that probably sounds like a bad translation, but that is the best translation that has ever been done of Benedict's Declaratio in the English language, because I have preserved all the errors he made in the Latin. So now, I think listening to that, you would say, we need to write that. You need a copy editor. There's some errors in there. Let's change a few phrases around. Let's certainly not publish this to the world. It will be an embarrassment to the Apostolic See. But that was not done. And in fact, this text that I just read you, this translation, is based not on the Latin he read that day, but on the version that was published about 7 days later. During the period of about 7 days, the Vatican kept publishing different versions of it, correcting this word here and that word here. Because when the Pope read it, he actually read the Latin that was in front of him with 2 errors in it. Okay, so they weren't sure what he actually said. So I have preserved in my translation, though, one thing that is not preserved in many other translations. Wherever Pope Benedict said munus, I translated munus. And wherever he said ministerium, I translated ministry. At all the translations on the Vatican website, whenever, except for the German, whenever the Pope said munus or ministerium, they translated it as ministry. Did you see that? And you know what the purpose of that is? To hide from the world that Pope Benedict was talking about 2 different things, munus and ministerium. So already anyone who is objective and fair would say, wait a minute, why would they want the whole world to think the Pope said something that he didn't say? There's something wrong then. Now, the Vatican's public position is that Pope has resigned the papacy, and they've published false translations. What is the honest, common sense conclusion? Their false translations have been published to sustain their opinion. But if their opinion has to be sustained by false translations, their opinion is not sustainable on the evidence, because if it was, they'd publish the evidence, but they didn't. They published false translations. So this should make everyone in the world, all the church, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, the deacons, and all the laity need to stop and say, whoa, the presumption that the Vatican's position is the correct one is completely destroyed. There is no longer any presumption that they're honest in what they're saying, because they've published false translations. They didn't publish an honest translation like the one I just did, okay? Or at least a translation that preserves that when Pope Benedict says munus, they translate it as munus, and when he says ministerium, they translate ministerium. But alas, this is not something new. If you look at the Code of Canon Law, and I think in every language it's been translated and published at the Vatican site, it is full of errors, and they've never corrected it. And most documents published since the Council, even the Council's own texts, Vatican II's, the translations are all false and erroneous. That's not what the Latin says. So this is not a problem that began with Pope Benedict's Renunciation. It's a problem that began with the reign of John the 23rd. Before that, they had excellent translations, and they made sure everything was right. So we have a big problem in the church because, as I said, the church is founded by God, who is truth, Jesus Christ, who is truth, and it's founded upon truth, the teachings of God and the apostles and the saints. So if they're publishing falsified documents, then we should doubt almost everything about their claims because they're not founded on truth. You must found your position on truth. And when we get to the Code of Canon Law, we'll see that this problem also occurs. So this Latin text that I translated, I mentioned before we should not judge the Pope, but I'm not judging the Pope, I'm just judging the Latin used. And I have found more than 40 grammatical, syntactical errors in the text. And I have an article at FromRome.Info video entitled Clamorous Errors in the Latin of the Renunciation. And you can read that. I'm not going to go through that because that would be a lecture in of itself, and a Latinist could understand it. But if you want to really, if you know some Latin, you go to that article and you'll see. So the Latinists were absolutely shocked when this document came out, and the first thing they were saying is, who advised him with that Latin? And and the reporters were saying, did you advise him? And they're all saying, I had nothing to do with it. And I had, by divine providence, the occasion to sit down one day for lunch with one of the top Latinists of Vatican after his retirement in the year 2016 and discuss with him this document. And I said, how many errors in it? He says, you don't want to know how many errors in it. It's an embarrassment to this day, and they felt it should be corrected, and it never was corrected. Okay. So if you love someone who is old and elderly and maybe having some difficulty expressing themselves, you know that you have striven with all your abilities to understand what they're trying to say and what they want to mean. And because you love them, you want their will to be executed. When my mother came down with dementia, she one day wanted to write a letter to her sister, so I gave her a piece of paper and she began to write. After about the first few words, she just couldn't write anymore, and she began to cry because she realized she could no longer think clearly enough to write a sentence, and she was a school teacher, so she knew how to write. And seeing that, I asked her why she wanted to write the letter, and she wanted to talk to her sister. She said, well, why don't we just call your sister? And so after a few days, we did a phone call, and she was able to speak to her sister. And that is how a faithful servant to the Pope should have reacted that day. He should have looked at this text and said, Your Holiness, before we publish this text to the world, if this is what you want to do, and if you want to publish this text, let's have the Latinists get together and correct it. It will only take a few days, and since we've had this meeting in private with the Cardinals, no one knows what you've said, actually, and so we don't put out what you say or don't announce with it, okay? The second thing they should have said is, Your Holiness, let us, is it your intention to give up the papacy? And from the answer he gives, then they should say, well, you need to rework this document so that it fulfills the requirements of law. Because when a pope renounces, he renounces as a man, and therefore he's subject to the law. None of that was done. Now, I often thought the Cardinals were totally surprised, but I saw a video some months ago, and Cardinal Sodano, as soon as the Pope finished this document, he got up and read a prepared statement that he had in little note paper. In fact, you can see him pulling the paper out and reading it to make sure he says the things that he needs to say. So Cardinal Sodano was given advance warning of what was to be said. I don't know if he was given the text. They still don't know that. But no one corrected it. Now, this is a major problem. Already we can see that the Cardinals were either incompetent and didn't know Latin, or their level of love and devotion to the Roman Pontiff was wanting. Okay, and when the Pope gets old and feeble and frail, it's the loyalty and devotion and competence of the Cardinals that becomes most obvious, or their lack thereof becomes most obvious. And here we have a case of it. I think it's clear from this text that it's obvious that the Pope no longer feels in some way capable. Okay, and he's talking about the Petrine Munus and the Petrine Ministerium. So it leaves you in a doubt in how much does he think he's incapable. and what he really wants to do. And that's a question that needs to be answered. The other thing is, it's obvious that it's a declaration. I declare that I renounce the ministry, okay? So a declaration in canon law is merely an announcement. It has no legal value. It's kind of like saying on Thursday next we're going to have papal mass in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. It's a statement of fact. It's not really a law, but it has almost, you know, if that's what they said, that's the hour they're going to have mass. So everyone who knew a little of this thing, and I was at Rome at the time, said, okay, so on the 28th of February he's going to renounce at 2000 hours, 8 in the evening. And on that day, around 6 o'clock, the Pope got in the helicopter and he flew to Castel Gandolfo, and he landed and he came out in the balcony. I was watching it live when he came out in the balcony. I wasn't there at Castel Gandolfo, I was in Rome. And I was expecting him to say, I renounce the papacy, okay, because he said he was going to do it at 8 o'clock on February 28th. But he didn't. He came out on the balcony, says something, these aren't his exact words, I'm no longer Pope, but I'm going to remain in a capacity of praying. And then he corrects himself, oh, it's not yet 8 o'clock. After 8 o'clock, I'll no longer be Pope. And then he went back inside. And my first reaction was like, whoa. He said he was going to renounce, but that's not a renunciation. Where's this renunciation? So I went back and looked in the text and I go, well, maybe he thinks that his declaration was renunciation. Or aren't the Cardinals going to... At that point, the Cardinals were probably all saying, oh my goodness. But someone should have objected. Now, there are Cardinals who have doctorates in canon law. Cardinal Brandmuller, Cardinal Burke, and I'm sure a whole host of others. At that point, they should have said, wait a moment, Pope, Your Holiness, you're still the Pope, because when you came out in the balcony, you didn't renounce. You just said after 8 o'clock, you'll no longer be Pope. But that's not what your document says. Your document says you're going to renounce on a certain day, and you announced that you're going to renounce, but you didn't renounce. So anyone with even a first-year degree in first years of studies in canon law, if you just take one course, you'll be able to understand that he announced it, but he didn't do it. And this is the first problem in the Renunciation, and this is what no one has told you, okay? So it's an established historic fact that the Pope announced that he was going to renounce the ministry. That's the fact. No one can deny that. He never renounced the ministry because he said, I declare that I renounce it so that the see will be vacant on such and such a day. He didn't say, I declare that, he didn't say, I renounce it, okay? So when you subordinate any statement with the phrase, I say that, or I declare, for example, if someone wants to buy a car from me, and he says, I'll buy the car from me if you're willing. Just tell me, are you willing to sell me the car? And I say, I declare that I am willing. Have I declared that have I said that I am willing? No, I have not. I've said, I declare that I am willing. It's kind of like saying, I pretend that I'm willing. I think that I'm willing. I hope that I'm willing. See, whenever you say, I hope, I think, I pray, and then that I'm willing, you haven't said you are willing. You have said something else. I hope, I think, I pray, okay. And that's perhaps something you don't learn in elementary school or even middle school, or maybe even not at college, but in the philosophy of logic, and this is what you are taught and you understand. And legal documents have to be precise in this way, because otherwise their meaning is vague, okay. So, granted that the Pope was an old man and could make mistakes, nevertheless, the Cardinals have the duty to correct it. Now, it's pretty obvious that since they didn't correct it, then there was no one among all the College of Cardinals who had the competence or willingness or zeal or devotion or loyalty to correct it. And this already is an established fact. I mean, I don't have to prove they didn't have it. The fact that they acted the way they did proves it. So we can... It's presumed then that the Cardinals are either incompetent, unwilling, or failing in their devotion or loyalty to the Holy Father because they didn't correct these obvious mistakes. We're not even getting into the error of what the Pope did, okay, which I will now discuss. So the Pope said, I declare that I renounce the ministry which I received from the hands of the Cardinals. No, everyone, when they heard that phrase, was like, "What are you talking about?" Because the ministry received from the hands of the cardinals, that phrase doesn't mean you're the papacy, because the Pope doesn't receive the papacy from the hands of the cardinals. He receives it directly from Jesus Christ on account of the fact that he has accepted his election as a Roman pontiff. Okay, so the cardinals don't give the papacy to the Pope; they elect a man to be Pope, and he says yes or no. And if he says yes, he receives the Petra Nunis directly from Jesus Christ, because St. Peter left it to the Roman Church as an inheritance, and only he who accepts his canonical election as Bishop of Rome receives the office. So what is this ministry they receive from the hands of the cardinals? The cardinals don't say to the Pope, "We now want you to run the club." That's not how the Catholic Church works, and that's not how the cardinal works, and that's not how papal law says it happens, okay? Nor even canon law. So he's saying something in the document that is praeter legem, meaning it has nothing to do with the law. He's saying something about it that's not what the law talks about. And this is the next fact that we should see, that his statement is legally defective, okay? Because we're all expecting, remember in our last program we talked about how do you know if a pope renounces? He's going to say, "I renounce the papacy." The other problem is that it appears to me that the cardinals all reacted as if the Code of 1917 was in function. And this is probably a very probable inference. And I say this because when the Pope read this document out loud, there was present for him only the members of the College of Cardinals. And they're all aged men, all over 65 pretty much. Maybe there's some younger than that. But that means all of them who studied canon law studied it before 1983. And therefore they were studying a canon law of the Code of 1917 and not the canon law of the Code of 1983. And why is this important? Because in 1917, in the Code, I think it's Canon 221, if I remember correctly, the Code of Canon Law says if a pope renounces for blah, 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 blah. Whereas in the Code of 1983 it says if the Roman pontiff renounces his munus. Okay, in the Code of 1917, if the Roman pontiff renounces, and 83, if the Roman pontiff renounces his munus. Notice the difference? Yes. So in the 1917 Code, there's just the verb renounce. There's no object to the verb. But in the Code of 1983, there's an object to the verb. So if there's no object to the verb, it doesn't matter what the Pope says he renounces, but it does matter that he uses the verb renounce. So as long as he uses the verb renounce, that's fine, that's it, let's get on to the conclave. And that's how the cardinals acted. And they acted, in my opinion, on the basis of how they studied canon law before the new code. And maybe even that's what Pope Benedict thought he was doing, I don't know. Okay. But the matter of fact is that the validity of a papal renunciation or a papal election depends on the existing papal law at the exact moment the thing took place. So at the exact moment the Pope renounced, what was the law? The Code of 1983, not the Code of 1917. And therefore, that's probably why the cardinals didn't have a knee-jerk reaction. Woe to them here, it's not in accord with the code. So that's what's happened, and in our next episode we'll discuss what the law requires so that we can judge whether what the Pope did was a renunciation of the papacy. My name is Brother Alexis Bugnolo, and this is the third episode of the documentary Pope Benedict's Renunciation, the facts, the laws, and the consequences. Please subscribe to this channel and let others know about this documentary series. I highly recommend that you share it with all the priests you know, because I'm putting it in a popular style, and it's for them. And it's all for also the lady, but I think that the priests need to actually listen to the facts stated in a very clear and objective fashion. Thank you, and have a nice day.